When I was growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s, I had a pretty simple idea of what life was like. My parents had good jobs, my brother and I were always running around to different soccer or basketball games. I even tried singing lessons for a few years. We also had a big family van and we went to Disney World a few times. What I learned later in my life is that my parents also used the money that they made to buy a house, pay it off over time, and save for retirement. Pretty much all the pieces that you'd put together to equal the ideal middle-class life. For people who grew up when they did, they were shown that if you work hard at a stable 9-to-5 job, then you'd get all those things. And it also meant that your kids would be in a good position to do even better than you. And that's kind of the same story that we're told in the media and society in general. But that concept hasn't actually come true. And no, I'm not talking about me specifically anymore. Right now, there's 56 million millennials in the workforce. That's over 1/3 of everyone who works. But the level of wealth that millennials hold altogether is probably a lot lower than you'd expect. They have just 6.4% or $8 trillion in wealth. But boomers, they are literally 10 times wealthier. Altogether, they hold on to 52% or $70 trillion in collective wealth. At first, I thought this makes a lot of sense, right? Older people have more wealth because they've had more time to actually make money and grow their net worth. And that's actually true. It does make sense that older generations have more wealth. But when I looked further into it, what's really crazy is just how much more wealth they have. If we look back in time again for a second, when boomers were the same age as millennials in 1989, they had 21% of the total wealth. So that's 21% versus the 6% that millennials hold. That means that millennials are almost 4 times behind the pace on their way to building wealth in the future. So why is this generational wealth gap so big? And how does wealth inequality play into this?
Take a look at this chart. It shows the difference between a worker's productivity and their compensation over time. You can see that the increase in how much a worker made in income almost exactly matches their productivity. So as their work generated more income for the economy, they made more money. Now, all of that started to change in the 1980s, and the gap between productivity and income has just continued to just grow bigger and bigger and bigger ever since. In fact, productivity has grown almost 4 times as much as pay. So basically, pay has been going up, but not by very much, and not at the levels that generations before us were seeing. So after hearing this, now what you might be thinking is, okay, so income hasn't grown a lot, which really sucks for us millennials and Gen Zs. But that's not all of it. The reality of the situation is that other things have grown a lot and gotten more expensive, but I bet you're not too surprised to hear that. The two really big ones are housing and education. And if we take a look at college costs in particular, they've grown like significantly over time. Like we're talking going from $10,000 in 1980 to almost $29,000 in 2020. That's a 180% increase over 40 years. And we know what it means when the price of college goes up. It means more student loan debt. Now, the average amount of student loan debt per person in the US is $40,000, pre anything being cleared with student loan forgiveness. Millennials are actually on track to being the most educated generation, but also the ones with the least amount of wealth that they've built up themselves. And we can't forget about the cost of housing. Like there's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to real estate, but to keep it simple, home ownership rates, so the number of people who actually own, are lower for millennials than any other previous generation. And on top of that, you can't forget that owning real estate is a big part of how people grow their wealth. So less homes being owned means that less wealth is being built. And it's really no surprise that housing prices have also gone up, right? Like the median amount that millennials are paying for homes in the US is $328,000. And listen, if you live in a place like New York City, or if you're Canadian living in Toronto or the GTA, the prices are a lot higher than that. But let's compare that 328 number to the median cost for boomers. They, adjusted for inflation, spent $216,000 for a house back in 1989. That's about a 50% increase in the price of housing, when again, wages only grew by 20%. So the younger generations have seen a very little increase in pay, but a big increase in the basics like housing and education.
Something Dennis just mentioned that's really interesting is that millennials will be the generation that build up the least wealth themselves. There's really 2 different ways that you can build wealth, right? There's the money that you make from your job and then you keep, so everything that's left after your expenses. If you invest that money, it grows over time. Then there's also the money that you inherit from your parents. So if your parents pass on and they leave any money to you, then that's added to your personal wealth too. So when we mention that the boomer generation has over half the wealth, it also means that they'll be handing over that $70 trillion fortune to their kids over the next 25 years. They're calling this the Great Wealth Transfer because it's the biggest wealth transfer that's ever happened, which is kind of obvious if you've been following along that this is the richest generation of people. But what it also means is that their kids, including millennials, will be inheriting a lot of money and bringing their personal wealth up, with a decent share of that wealth coming from this money that's being inherited as opposed to the money that they've made and kept for themselves. Now, the whole time I've been saying all of this, there's been these little alarm bells going off inside my head because I'm missing a huge part of this. And that's the fact that not everyone's going to be receiving an inheritance. Even though the boomer generation is wealthy compared to other generations and they're going to be transferring over $70 trillion, about half of that money is coming from the top 1.5% of households. Take that in for a second. That means that about $35 trillion is going to the top 1.5% of people, and it means the other $35 trillion is going to the other 98.5%. And that's not even really true, because realistically, a big chunk of that money is going to go to the top 10% of families and so on from there, leaving very little money for everyone else. So on top of the generational wealth gap, we're also dealing with a major wealth inequality gap, which is only going to be amplified over the next few decades. And keep in mind that we're talking about wealth, not income. Income inequality also exists, but it's just not as extreme as wealth inequality because wealth grows. Over time, the economy grows and becomes richer, which means that things like stocks and real estate become more valuable. There's obviously some ups and downs, but overall the market grows, which means that anyone who owns these things is going to see their wealth grow too.
This has caused the wealth gap between the richest people and everyone else to become honestly just really, really big, and here's why. In 1989, the top 1%, so the very, very richest people, owned just over 20% of total wealth. Now, they own just over 30%. That's a 10% increase for just the 1% alone. So where did this increase come from? Well, one part of it is actually the stock market seeing a ton of growth over the past few decades. Just take a look at the S&P 500 and how dramatically it's grown since the 1980s. And guess what? Who's made the most money from all this growth? It's the richest 1% of people. This small group owns 50% of all stocks, and the top 10% of people own 90% of the entire stock market. So even though there's been more and more people investing over the last few years, which is once again amazing, the concentration of money is still in the hands of a very small group of people. Really, the biggest problem goes back to the whole passing on wealth to the younger generation thing. Most of the money will be passed on to the richest people in the younger generation. The very richest people will pass their wealth on to their kids, and that wealth will continue growing, so they can literally just live off of it and it'll still grow, and that cycle just continues. People are calling this dynastic wealth, so literally creating dynasties because they have so much money that just literally won't run out. This factor alone really just shows you that people don't actually earn their worth in the market, and that economic gains don't just go to the people who deserve them. What's crazy is that there's actually been things in place to slow down the concentration of wealth before. For example, the estate tax and the capital gains tax. So to kind of break this down, estate tax is a tax that's placed on the wealth that someone has accumulated throughout their lifetime that's meant to be paid by their kids when they inherit the money. So the people who did the work to earn the money won't get taxed on it, but the kids inheriting the money without actually directly working for it will. Capital gains tax, on the other hand, is a tax on the increased value of your investments, so for example stocks, that you would pay once you actually sell and you take out that money.
Now, those two taxes still exist, but over time there's been different tax cuts and loopholes or different ways to get away with not paying those taxes that have come up. Like a few years ago in the US, they introduced an estate tax cut that now lets people pass over $11 million to their kids completely tax-free. And then for capital gains, the main loophole that exists for generational wealth is that if someone holds on to their investments until they die, their kids can then inherit them and pay no capital gains tax at all. The increased value is basically just erased. So these different taxes that were in place to keep the crazy dynastic wealth under control just aren't as effective anymore. But the thing about wealth is that it doesn't just mean that people have more money. It also means that they have more power. So when the top 1% of people have the majority of the wealth, it also means that they have the majority of the power to make sure that they keep growing their wealth at these crazy high levels. These ultra-rich people worked hard for their money, but they didn't earn every single dollar that they make. That literally comes from the different systems and policies that are in place that have allowed their wealth to continue to grow at these levels and have outpaced everyone else. Here's the thing, both the generational wealth gap and the wealth inequality gap can feel a little overwhelming. So if you're yelling at me, "So what?" to the screen right now, then here's what I can tell you. If you're aware of these things, then you're already a step ahead. And that's the biggest reason why Den and I like to actually talk about these topics on our channel once we learn about them. We think that the best way to grow your own wealth is to know how the system works so you can work it. And that means doing what you can to keep as much money as you can from your income and then invest that money. If you only have one takeaway from this entire video, then we want it to be you thinking about the difference between income and wealth. And in order to grow your wealth, you need to own assets like stocks and potentially real estate that can actually grow for you over time.
If you don't know where to start with investing, then check out this video next on how to invest your first $1,000, where we literally walk you through everything from the start. And yeah, after that, make sure you like down below and stay tuned for next week's video. We will be here. You guys already know the vibes, and let's go.